There is someone in your life who has said wonderful things about you in front of others. You have heard it secondhand. The compliments they offered when you weren't in the room, the generous account of your abilities they gave to people who matter, the warmth with which they spoke about you publicly in ways that made you feel, when the reports reached you, genuinely seen. And there is something else you have sensed. Not always clearly, not always with enough evidence to name it. In the private moments, in the slight edge to certain comments, in the questions designed to introduce doubt about something you've recently achieved, in the enthusiasm for your setbacks that arrives dressed as sympathy, in the way the warmth of the public account never quite survives the transition into a room that contains only the two of you. You have not known what to do with that gap, because the public record is so generous, because questioning it makes you sound paranoid, ungrateful, unable to accept that someone genuinely admires you. Because the gap between what they say about you publicly and what you experience from them privately is precisely wide enough to make you doubt your own perception before you doubt theirs. Nietzsche wrote in Human, All Too Human, published in 1878, that the most sophisticated forms of hostility are the ones that never abandon the language of friendship. Not because the hostility is always conscious, but because the human capacity for self-deception is deep enough that a person can genuinely believe they admire you while simultaneously being organized at a level below their awareness around the project of your diminishment. That is what this video is about. Not conspiracy, not villainy. A mechanism, one that Nietzsche identified with precision that psychology has spent a century catching up to. If you have ever felt that particular dissonance, the gap between how someone speaks about you publicly and how they treat you privately, give this video a like right now, because what follows is going to make visible something that has been operating in your life with your own confusion as its primary cover. 1. Why public praise is sometimes the most efficient form of private control. Irving Goffman spent decades mapping the architecture of social performance, the continuous, largely unconscious management of impression that governs how human beings present themselves and others in social space. In his foundational work on interaction ritual, he identified something that most people experience but rarely examine directly. The person who controls the public narrative about you controls something more significant than your reputation. They control the frame through which your behavior will be interpreted by everyone who has heard their account. Public praise, deployed strategically, and it does not need to be consciously strategic to function strategically, establishes a frame that serves the praiser in ways that are almost impossible to identify from the outside. By positioning themselves as your most generous advocate, they secure a specific social role, the person who sees your value most clearly, who has access to your genuine qualities in ways others don't, who is uniquely positioned to offer the authoritative account of who you are. That position is extraordinarily useful because it means that when the private undermining begins, the subtle doubt introduced in closed conversations, the careful excavation of your limitations in contexts where you cannot respond, the enthusiasm for your failures that arrives wearing the syntax of concern, it comes from a source that has been pre-established as your greatest defender. The credibility of the public praise is the very thing that makes the private destruction effective. You cannot argue against someone who has already told everyone how much they believe in you. Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, described this as one of the primary operations of what he called the will to power in its covert form, the expression of dominance not through direct confrontation, but through the management of the social environment in ways that position the other person as dependent on the narrative the powerful one controls. The praise is not false, but it is also not free. It is an investment in a social architecture that pays returns the recipient of the praise never agreed to provide. 2. The neuroscience of envy and why it cannot survive your success. In 2009, neuroscientist Hidehiko Takahashi at the University of Tokyo published findings that remain among the most clarifying in the social neuroscience of human motivation. Using neuroimaging to track brain activity during social comparison scenarios, his team found that envy and schadenfreude, the pleasure derived from another person's misfortune, activate overlapping neural regions and appear to function as a linked system. The same people who showed the strongest envy responses when observing others' success showed the strongest schadenfreude responses when those same people subsequently experienced setbacks. What this means for the person who praises you publicly while undermining you privately is uncomfortable but clarifying. The two behaviors are not contradictions. They are expressions of the same underlying state, operating in different social contexts. The praise in public is the face of the envy that cannot be shown. The destruction in private is the envy finding its release in the only space where it doesn't cost the person their social position as your admirer. Richard Smith at the University of Kentucky, whose research on envy has produced some of the field's most practically useful findings, identified what he calls benign versus malicious envy. The distinction between envy that motivates the envious person to improve themselves and envy that motivates them to reduce the person they envy. Malicious envy, his research consistently shows, does not announce itself as envy. It arrives dressed in the language of concern, of honest feedback, of the kind of hard truth that only a real friend would be willing to say. Nietzsche, in On the Genealogy of Morality, had named this structure resentment, long before the neuroimaging existed to confirm its architecture. He described how the person who cannot tolerate another's elevation without experiencing it as their own diminishment finds ways to restore the equilibrium that the other's success has disrupted, not through their own ascent, which requires the risk of genuine effort, through the reduction of the person who has risen, conducted always through channels that maintain deniability, that maintain in public the face of the admirer. 3. What the private destruction actually sounds like, because it is rarely dramatic, rarely obvious, rarely anything that would survive being named directly in the moment it occurs. It sounds like questions introduced at the precise moment you need confidence. Are you sure this is the right move? I just want to make sure you've thought through all the angles. It sounds like the enthusiastic sharing of information about someone who has failed at something similar to what you're attempting. Not as a warning, but as a story, delivered with a sympathy that contains, if you listen carefully, a faint note of satisfaction. It sounds like the compliment that arrives with a qualifier so precisely placed that the compliment does most of the social work, while the qualifier does the actual damage. You're so good at this, considering everything you've been dealing with. It sounds like the private conversation where your recent success is reinterpreted, where the people who weren't there are given a version of events that casts your achievement in a light slightly less flattering than the one in which it actually occurred, where the account is not false enough to be called a lie, but is shaped carefully enough that the impression it leaves is not the impression your success deserved. Goffman called this backstage behavior, the conduct that occurs in spaces where the front stage performance of the relationship doesn't need to be maintained. The public praise is front stage. It is what the relationship presents to the audience. The backstage is where the actual processing of the relationship occurs, where the envy finds its expression, where the architecture of your diminishment is constructed, where the person who applauded you most loudly in the last room is doing the work that the applause was covering. Nietzsche, in Twilight of the Idols, wrote about the specific cowardice embedded in this pattern, the unwillingness to bring genuine feeling into direct encounter, the preference for the controlled environment of the private conversation over the exposed honesty of direct confrontation. It is not strength that drives the backstage destruction. It is its absence. The inability to be present with envy, with genuine admiration, with the complexity of caring about someone whose success activates something uncomfortable. The destruction is what happens when those feelings have nowhere honest to go. Think about a specific person in your life. someone whose public warmth has always coexisted with a private edge you couldn't quite name. Comment below. I see the gap. Just that. Because the person who needs that sentence has been second-guessing their own perception for long enough. 4. Why you keep missing it, and what keeps the mechanism invisible. The gap between public praise and private destruction survives as long as it does for a reason that has nothing to do with your intelligence or your perceptiveness. It survives because of a specific feature of how human beings process social information, one that the mechanism exploits with a precision that looks from the inside, like your own failure to see clearly. Robert Cialdini's research on influence documented what he called the liking principle, the consistent finding that we are significantly more likely to accept information from people we believe, like us, to interpret their behavior charitably, to discount evidence that contradicts the positive account we have of the relationship. When someone has established themselves as your public admirer, the liking principle works against you. Every piece of contradicting evidence, every private comment that doesn't fit the public narrative, gets processed through the frame of the established relationship rather than evaluated on its own terms. You discount the edge in their comment because they've said such generous things about you publicly. You reinterpret the enthusiasm for your setback as concern because concern is consistent with the admirer's role they've established. You explain away the pattern because the alternative, that the person whose public warmth you've relied on is also organizing a significant portion of their private social life around your diminishment, is a recognition that asks something of you that you're not yet ready to give. Dacher Keltner's research on power and social perception adds a dimension that completes the picture. People in relationships where they feel valued and seen tend to extend significantly more charitable interpretation to the behavior of the person they believe values them. The praise has made you feel seen, and feeling seen makes you generous with interpretation, which is precisely the condition under which the private destruction is most effective and most invisible. Nietzsche, in Beyond Good and Evil, described this as one of the primary mechanisms through which what he called noble natures are exploited, not through their weaknesses, but through their strength. Your capacity for genuine appreciation, your willingness to extend trust, your tendency to interpret generously. These are not flaws. They are the specific qualities that the mechanism requires to function. The exploitation is of what is best in you, not what is worst. This channel exists outside the algorithm. No sponsorships, no brand deals, just research, writing, and the belief that ideas sharp enough to change how you see yourself are worth protecting. If this is giving you language for something you have been sensing without being permitted to name, consider supporting this work directly through the link in the description. Every contribution keeps this independent, and that independence is exactly what makes this kind of honesty possible. 5. What Nietzsche says you owe yourself, and how to respond. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche returned repeatedly to a specific form of discernment that he considered among the highest psychological achievements available to a person: the capacity to read what is actually in front of you rather than what you have been positioned to see. Not cynicism, not the reflexive distrust of everyone who offers warmth. Something more precise than that. The ability to hold the public account and the private experience simultaneously, without allowing either to cancel the other, and to draw conclusions from the totality rather than from the more comfortable half. The person who praises you publicly and undermines you privately is giving you, if you are willing to receive it, a significant amount of information about the specific shape of their insecurity, about what your success costs them at a level they have not examined, about the gap between who they present themselves as being and what is actually driving their behavior in spaces where the presentation doesn't need to be maintained. That information is not an invitation to confrontation. Confronting this pattern directly, naming the gap, demanding consistency between public and private, almost never produces what it seems like it should produce. Because the person running this pattern is, in most cases, not conscious of running it. The self-deception is genuine. The admiration, at some level, is real. Confrontation asks them to acknowledge something their own psychology has organized itself specifically to avoid acknowledging. The result is almost always denial, injury, and the further consolidation of the dynamic you are trying to disrupt. What Nietzsche's framework actually recommends is something quieter and more powerful than confrontation, the withdrawal of the audience the mechanism requires. The mechanism depends on your continued investment in the public narrative, your continued need for the praise, your continued willingness to discount the private evidence in favor of the public account. Remove that need and the mechanism loses its leverage. Not because you've confronted anyone, because you've stopped requiring something that was being used to organize you. Epictetus in the Enchiridion made the distinction that applies most precisely here. Your assessment of yourself belongs to you. The public narrative someone else constructs about you, however generously, does not. When you have built a relationship with your own judgment that is stable enough not to require their praise as its foundation, the praise becomes what it actually is, information about them. And the private destruction becomes what it actually is, the same information, less carefully packaged. Now let's close this with the full honesty it requires. Two things can be true simultaneously and must be held together for this conversation to be of any genuine use. The first, the pattern described in this video is real. It operates in the lives of most people who have achieved anything visible enough to activate envy in someone close to them. The gap between public warmth and private hostility is not a product of oversensitivity or paranoia. It is a documented psychological mechanism with a coherent architecture. One that Nietzsche named, that neuroscience has confirmed, and that you have, if this video has landed with any weight, experienced directly. The second, not every person whose public praise coexists with private criticism is running this mechanism. Some people are genuinely trying to support you in public while being honest with you in private about things they see that concern them. The distinction between honest private concern from someone who genuinely wants your success and the covert undermining of someone organized around your diminishment is not always easy to locate, but it can be located. Honest private criticism makes you more capable. The other kind makes you smaller, more doubtful, more dependent on the public praise as the antidote to the private edge. That difference, in effect, is the most reliable diagnostic available. Nietzsche's most essential philosophical contribution across this territory is not the analysis. It is the standard embedded in the analysis, that genuine relationship. The kind worth investing in, worth protecting, worth reorganizing your life to maintain, is the kind that is consistent across contexts. That does not require the management of a gap between what is performed in public and what is expressed in private. That makes you more fully yourself in both registers, rather than more dependent in one and more diminished in the other. 2 questions for the comments. First, what is the specific form this has taken in your life? The relationship where the gap between public warmth and private behavior has been most costly to your sense of yourself. Second, what would change in how you receive public praise if you trusted your private experience of the relationship at least as much as you trusted the account being offered to the room? Leave it below. The specific answers are the ones that reach the people who need them most. And if this kind of examination, the honest, precise dismantling of the social mechanisms that have been operating in your most important relationships, is work you want to continue, subscribe, because the next video goes directly into territory that connects to what this one opened. The person who applauds you loudest is not always your greatest ally. Learning to read the gap, without losing your capacity for genuine trust, might be the most practically important thing this channel ever offers you.